Behind every marble-white close-up and every carefully staged studio photograph stood a woman who refused to be edited. The Golden Age sold America a fantasy of untouchable glamour, but off-camera, its biggest stars were rewriting the rules of desire, marriage, and scandal faster than any censor could keep up. One night, a 14-year-old girl would end it all with a kitchen knife. That's where our story begins. Actor number 1, Lana Turner. She was 16 years old, sipping a soda at a counter on Sunset Boulevard, when a talent scout noticed her. Some say it was Schwab's Pharmacy, others insist it was the Top Hat Cafe a few blocks away. Either way, the story became Hollywood legend almost overnight, a girl plucked from obscurity simply for existing in the right place at the right moment. A tight sweater and an unforgettable silhouette earned her a nickname that would follow her for the rest of her career, the Sweater Girl. Within a few short years, she was one of MGM's most bankable stars. But if her rise felt like a fairy tale, her personal life read like a runaway melodrama that no studio writer could have plotted. Turner married 8 times, to 7 different men, prompting one wag of the era to quip that her love life was just like a sweater, she pulls it on, then off, then on again. The gossip columns adored her. She gave them plenty to print. Nothing, however, prepared the public for April of 1958. Turner was involved with a man named Johnny Stompanato, a boyfriend with deep ties to organized crime and a documented history of violence toward her. On the night in question, her 14-year-old daughter, Cheryl Crane, stepped between them and stabbed Stompanato to death in the kitchen of their Beverly Hills home. An inquest ruled it a justifiable homicide, a desperate act by a child protecting her mother from abuse. The scandal exploded across front pages nationwide, threatening to end Turner's career overnight. It didn't. Remarkably, that same year, she delivered one of the finest performances of her life in Imitation of Life, a film that became a massive box office success and reminded the industry exactly why she'd been a star in the first place. Friends who knew her away from the cameras described a warm, generous woman, unlucky in love again and again, yet never cynical about it. She called herself a romantic at heart who simply never stopped believing the next marriage might be the one. Her career stretched across 4 decades, eventually carrying her into television stardom on the primetime soap Falcon Crest. What made the Stompanato case even more haunting was the trial itself, held behind closed doors in a coroner's court rather than a public trial, with Turner giving testimony so raw and unrehearsed that reporters in the room described the courtroom as dead silent. Crane herself would spend years afterward defending her mother's choices in interviews, insisting that the label, scandal, never captured what the household had actually endured behind closed doors. For a time, studio executives quietly debated whether Turner's career could survive the headlines at all, a debate that ended the moment audiences packed theaters for Imitation of Life and made it one of the highest-grossing pictures of the year. Turner herself rarely spoke about the tragedy in later interviews, preferring to let her work answer the question of whether she deserved a second chance. Colleagues who worked with her in the years that followed described a woman who had grown quieter, more guarded, but no less magnetic on camera, as though the trauma had simply been folded into the same performance skill that had made her a star in the first place. She continued marrying, continued making headlines, and continued, against every expectation, building one of the longest careers of any actress of her generation. Turner survived scandal by sheer talent and nerve, proving that Hollywood's appetite for a comeback story could sometimes outweigh even its appetite for gossip. But not every leading lady of her era could say the same, and the next star's story begins not with a knife in a kitchen, but with an obsession that started the moment she saw a married man perform on a London stage, and never once considered that his wife might stand in her way. Actor number 2, Vivien Leigh. Long before she became immortal as Scarlett O'Hara, Vivien Leigh was already famous within her own social circle for one particular trait: when she wanted something, nothing, and no one, was going to stand in her way. She was breathtakingly beautiful, magnetic to the leading men who shared the screen with her, and by all accounts entirely convinced that other people's feelings were negotiable details in the pursuit of her own desires. The clearest proof came the night she watched Laurence Olivier perform on stage. Leigh turned to a friend and calmly announced that he was the man she was destined to marry, Never mind that she was already married to her first husband, Herbert Lee Holman, and that Olivier had a wife of his own, actress Jill Esmond. Undeterred, Lee pursued him. When the Olivers vacationed in Capri, she reportedly followed. The affair that followed didn't pause even when Esmond became pregnant. Olivier eventually left his wife, and he and Lee married soon after, a union built, quite literally, on the wreckage of 2 other marriages. For years, Larry and Vivian were held up as one of Hollywood's great romantic pairings, a golden couple whose chemistry seemed to leap off the screen and into real life. But the marriage that began an obsession did not age gracefully. It was marked by volatility that those close to the couple struggled to explain at the time. What we now understand, with the benefit of modern psychiatric knowledge, is that Lee very likely suffered from bipolar disorder, a condition with no effective treatment available in her lifetime, and one that almost certainly shaped the erratic, sometimes explosive behavior that colored her personal relationships for decades. Lee and Olivier divorced in 1960. She went on to date actor John Maravalli for 7 years, until her death from tuberculosis in 1967. Along the way, she had been linked, with varying degrees of certainty, to some of the biggest names in the industry: Marlon Brando, Elia Kazan, Orson Welles, Warren Mitchell, Alexander Korda, Stuart Granger, and Peter Finch. During the height of her fame, Lee's condition was rarely discussed in the language we would use today. Instead, her mood swings, sudden bursts of energy, and equally sudden collapses were often dismissed by the press as temperament, the sort of behavior audiences were conditioned to expect from a beautiful, difficult actress. Those closest to her, including Olivier himself, later described periods where she seemed like an entirely different person, manic, restless, and prone to statements and actions she couldn't fully explain once the episode passed. Without a diagnosis or treatment framework that could have helped her, Lee was left to navigate a serious psychiatric condition largely alone, in full view of a public that had no context for what they were witnessing. It's worth remembering that this same woman delivered 2 of the most enduring performances in cinema history, as Scarlett O'Hara and later as Blanche DuBois, a role that, in retrospect, feels almost eerily close to her own unraveling. Colleagues who worked with her on A Streetcar Named Desire later admitted the line between actress and character sometimes seemed to blur entirely, a testament to a talent so consuming it may have come at real personal cost. Lee chased love with a ferocity that left a trail of broken marriages behind her, and paid for that intensity with a private struggle the public rarely understood in her lifetime. But the next star didn't need to chase anyone, she simply had to survive 5 husbands, and a childhood trauma the world wouldn't learn about until decades after her final film wrapped. Actor number 3, Rita Hayworth. On screen, she was marketed as nothing less than the love goddess of the 1940s, the pin-up who defined desire for a generation of soldiers fighting overseas. Her single hair toss in Gilda, one unforgettable gesture in 1946, became one of the most iconic images in cinema history. But the woman behind that image, born Margarita Carmen Cancino to a Spanish father and American mother, had spent her whole career being reshaped into someone else entirely. She began performing as a child in her father's dance act, and entered films as a teenager, initially confined to small parts that leaned hard into her Latin heritage. Everything changed when Columbia Pictures chief Harry Cohn took an interest in her career, on the condition that she be transformed. Hayworth underwent painful electrolysis to raise her hairline and dyed her naturally black hair a fiery red, systematically erasing the visible markers of her Spanish roots so Hollywood could sell her as something more palatable to American audiences. Her romantic life, much like her image, seemed engineered for public consumption, and just as unstable underneath. Hayworth married 5 times, including to legendary director Orson Welles and later Prince Ali Khan, a union that made her a real-life princess years before Grace Kelly ever wore a crown. None of it brought her lasting happiness. The most devastating revelation came only after her death. Her daughter with Welles, Rebecca, disclosed that Hayworth had been sexually abused by her own father as a child, a trauma that almost certainly shaped her fraught, often painful relationships with men for the rest of her life. The glamorous, love goddess persona, it turned out, was armor built over wounds the public never saw. The gap between the love goddess image and Hayworth's private reality was, by the accounts of those who knew her, almost total. Friends and colleagues frequently described her as shy, even withdrawn, off camera, the opposite of the confident seductress audiences saw in Gilda and countless magazine spreads. Orson Welles himself later reflected that the woman he married bore almost no resemblance to the pin-up the studio had built around her, and that the disconnect between the two seemed to weigh on her more with each passing year. Hayworth reportedly once remarked that men fell in love with Gilda, but woke up disappointed to find only her. Her later years brought a further layer of tragedy. Hayworth began exhibiting memory lapses and erratic behavior that, for years, were misattributed to alcoholism, before she was finally, correctly diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease, one of the first public figures whose struggle helped bring broader awareness to the condition. Her daughter Yasmin became a devoted caretaker and later an advocate for Alzheimer's research, carrying forward a legacy shaped as much by resilience as by heartbreak. Hayworth's story is a reminder that Hollywood's most seductive images were often built to hide something far more painful underneath. The next star scandal, by contrast, played out in full, humiliating public view, when she fell for her own best friend's husband, and the entire country watched it happen in real time. Actor number 4 Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor was famous for two things in equal measure: her talent, which earned her 2 Academy Awards, and her looks, anchored by a pair of startling violet eyes that seemed almost unreal on camera. But by the late 1950s, she had become something else entirely, arguably the single most talked about woman in American entertainment, for reasons that had nothing to do with acting. The scandal that defined this chapter of her life began when Taylor started seeing singer Eddie Fisher, while he was still married to Debbie Reynolds, Taylor's close friend. It wasn't a quiet flirtation. It played out under a merciless press spotlight, transforming Taylor almost overnight from a beloved star into a public villain. When Fisher's marriage to Reynolds ended, he and Taylor married. The union didn't last, but the damage to her friendship with Reynolds felt, for a time, irreparable. Taylor reportedly felt genuine remorse for what she'd done and offered Reynolds a heartfelt apology. In one of old Hollywood's quieter but more remarkable footnotes, the two women eventually reconciled and remained close for the rest of their lives. The Fisher scandal turned out to be only one chapter in an extraordinarily eventful romantic history. Over her lifetime, Taylor married 7 times to 6 different men, including actor Richard Burton, whom she married not once but twice, in a relationship so combustible and magnetic that it became a kind of ongoing public spectacle in its own right. After her final divorce in 1996, from construction worker Larry Fortensky, Taylor made a decision that surprised many who'd followed her for decades. She simply stopped. She remained single until her death in 2011. For much of her career, Taylor's personal life eclipsed her professional accomplishments in the public conversation, overshadowing 2 Oscar-winning performances. But in her later years, she redirected the same intensity that had fueled decades of tabloid headlines into something else entirely, becoming one of the earliest and most influential celebrity advocates for AIDS research, ultimately helping raise millions of dollars for the cause at a time when the disease carried enormous stigma. The press coverage of the Fisher affair set a template that would follow Taylor for the rest of her career. Every subsequent relationship, every marriage, every divorce became a media event covered with the intensity usually reserved for political scandals. When she began her relationship with Richard Burton on the set of Cleopatra, both still married to other people, the Vatican itself publicly condemned the affair, an almost unimaginable level of scrutiny for 2 working actors. Yet, Liz and Dick went on to become one of the most famous, most volatile, and most genuinely passionate partnerships in entertainment history, a relationship so combustible that divorcing once apparently wasn't enough to end it. Through all of it, Taylor never seemed to fully internalize the public's judgment of her. She spoke openly, decades before it was fashionable for major stars to do so, about her own struggles with addiction and body image, refusing to let the tabloid version of her story become the only version. Her pivot toward AIDS activism in the 1980s, at a moment when many of her peers wouldn't even say the word publicly, transformed her from a punchline about excess into one of the most respected humanitarian voices to ever come out of the industry. Taylor's scandals were loud, relentless, and impossible to escape. The next star's romantic history was almost impossible to fully count, because even she, by her own admission, seemed to lose track of it long before the public tried to. Actor number 5, Ava Gardner. Frank Sinatra wrote songs about her. That alone tells you something about the effect Ava Gardner had on the men around her. But Sinatra wasn't remotely the only one who fell under her spell, and he wasn't even her first husband. In the early 1940s, Gardner married actor Mickey Rooney, a union that lasted only a short time. Afterward, Rooney would boast publicly about how wonderful their relationship had been. Gardner, for her part, offered a rather different account, telling anyone who'd listen that whatever Rooney had enjoyed about their time together, she certainly hadn't shared the feeling. From there, her romantic history reads almost like a tour of the era's most notorious men, the eccentric billionaire Howard Hughes, jazz bandleader Artie Shaw, and finally Frank Sinatra himself, whom she married in 1951 in a relationship as turbulent as it was famous. Later, while vacationing in Cuba, Gardner became romantically involved with Ernest Hemingway. And that list barely scratches the surface. By most accounts, it would be genuinely impossible to count every man Gardner dated across her lifetime, because the names history remembers are only a fraction of her actual romantic history. What set Gardner apart wasn't just the volume of her relationships, but the total absence of apology in how she lived them. Her looks and her confidence made her irresistible to nearly every man who crossed her path in Hollywood, but she moved through her own life entirely on her own terms, never bending to the era's expectations that women, especially famous ones, behave with quiet propriety. In a decade when female stars were groomed to seem demure and reserved for the cameras, Gardner simply refused the script. Even her most famous marriage, to Sinatra, was defined by an almost mythic level of turbulence. Reports of screaming matches in hotel lobbies, reconciliations played out for photographers, and a mutual jealousy so intense that both parties seemed to feed off it rather than shy away from it. Sinatra reportedly attempted suicide during one particularly dark stretch of their relationship, a detail that underscores just how consuming their connection actually was, far beyond the glossy tabloid version fans consumed at the time. In later life, Gardner relocated to London, largely retreating from the Hollywood machine that had once obsessed over her every move. She remained close friends with several of her former lovers well into old age, a rarity in an industry where romantic entanglements typically ended in bitterness. Friends recalled her as someone who genuinely never regretted the life she'd lived, treating each relationship as a chapter rather than a mistake, and refusing interviewers who tried to frame her romantic history as some kind of cautionary tale. Gardner's freedom came at the cost of constant scrutiny, a price she seemed entirely willing to pay for the rest of her life. The next star's freedom came at a far higher price still, a decades-long battle with addiction that Hollywood itself helped manufacture, then quietly profited from. Actor number 6, Judy Garland. Few names are as synonymous with the golden age of Hollywood as Judy Garland, and few stars paid a steeper personal price for that stardom. Born Frances Ethel Gumm, she was pushed into the spotlight as a child by a famously controlling stage mother, who played a direct role in molding her into a performer almost from the moment she could walk onto a stage. MGM signed her at just 13 years old, and from that point forward, her life was never entirely her own again. The studio system that made Garland a star also very nearly destroyed her. Her schedule was punishing, she often worked on 2 or 3 films simultaneously, and the studio controlled not just her career but her body, placing her on a strict diet, and more troublingly, supplying her with pills meant to help her sleep at night and wake her again each morning so she could keep pace with the grueling production calendar. It was this studio-sanctioned routine that planted the seeds of a substance abuse struggle that would follow her for the rest of her life. Despite the toll it took on her, Garland's talent was undeniable, and stardom came quickly. Her performances in The Wizard of Oz and A Star is Born remain touchstones of American film, evidence of a once-in-a-generation gift that no amount of personal turmoil could dim. But her private life told a much harder story. She married 5 times, and each relationship drew intense media scrutiny. According to one husband's later biography, Garland was frequently pursued by some of the most powerful men in the industry throughout her career. The addiction that began with studio-issued pills became a lifelong battle, one Garland never fully escaped. She attempted suicide on more than one occasion, a painful testament to the depth of the suffering that lay beneath one of the most beloved public personas of the era. What made Garland's situation especially devastating was how normalized the studio's control over her body and mind actually was at the time. Executives openly discussed her weight in production meetings, nicknamed her unflatteringly behind her back, and treated the pills that fueled her schedule as a routine cost of doing business rather than a crisis in the making. She later said in interviews that she felt like a product being manufactured rather than a person being developed as an artist, a sentiment that, decades later, would come to define broader conversations about the treatment of child stars across the entertainment industry. Despite everything working against her, Garland's live performances in the final years of her career, particularly her legendary 1961 Carnegie Hall concert, are still regarded by critics as among the greatest ever recorded, evidence that her talent never dimmed even as her health continued to decline. She died in 1969 at just 47 years old, and her funeral drew crowds so large they spilled into the streets of Manhattan, a testament to just how deeply her voice and her struggles had resonated with the public. Garland's story stands as Hollywood at its most exploitative, a child star consumed by the very machine that made her famous, and never fully released from its grip. The next star knew that same machine intimately too, and somehow turned it into a myth so powerful it outlived her by decades. Actor number 7, Marilyn Monroe. No figure from the Golden Age has generated more speculation, more myth-making, and more genuine controversy than Marilyn Monroe. Born Norma Jean Mortensen, she rose to stardom with startling speed, becoming a global symbol of beauty and sensuality almost overnight, and from very early on, her personal life became just as central to her fame as her acting career. According to a biography by film historian Darwin Porter, Monroe had a brief relationship with actor Rock Hudson back when she was still a struggling starlet, years before either of them became household names. Monroe reportedly told him plainly that they'd both need to cultivate relationships with more influential people in Hollywood if they wanted to get anywhere, advice Hudson apparently took seriously as his own career developed. Monroe herself was also rumored, though never conclusively confirmed, to have had affairs with a number of powerful men in the industry. Whatever the truth of those rumors, there's no disputing the scale of Monroe's talent or the complexity of the woman behind the image. Her documented relationships included 2 marriages, to baseball legend Joe DiMaggio and playwright Arthur Miller, each a study in contrasts with the dumb blonde persona the studios sold to the public. Her alleged affair with President John F. Kennedy has become one of the most enduring pieces of American celebrity mythology, especially after her famously sultry rendition of Happy Birthday at Madison Square Garden. What often gets lost in the speculation is just how sharp Monroe actually was. Frustrated by being typecast in shallow roles, she broke her studio contract outright, moved to New York, and studied under Lee Strasberg at the prestigious Actors Studio, a serious pursuit of craft that ran directly against her public image. She then returned to Hollywood and did something almost unheard of for an actress at the time. She started her own production company. Her death in August 1962, ruled a probable suicide from a barbiturate overdose, immediately became one of the most scrutinized events in American celebrity history, spawning conspiracy theories that persist to this day, many of them tangled up in the rumored Kennedy connection. Investigators, biographers, and amateur researchers alike have spent more than 6 decades revisiting the final hours of her life, and no consensus has ever fully emerged, only competing narratives, each shaped as much by the era's anxieties as by the available evidence. What tends to get lost beneath the mythology is the sheer difficulty of the path Monroe actually walked. She grew up largely in foster care and an orphanage, without the kind of stability most of her Hollywood peers took for granted, and she built her entire public identity from scratch, calculating every photograph and public appearance with far more intention than the dumb blonde persona ever suggested. Colleagues who worked closely with her, including directors who initially dismissed her as difficult, often changed their assessment after seeing how deliberately she shaped her own performances. Monroe's legacy remains a tangle of triumph, tragedy, and enduring myth that still captivates the world more than 60 years after her death. But the next star's fame was built on something Monroe never quite managed to secure for herself: total, unapologetic control over her own image, in an industry engineered from top to bottom to control every woman who appeared on its screens. Actor number 8, Jane Mansfield. Aside from Mae West, few actresses in Hollywood history match Jane Mansfield for sheer romantic and publicity daring. The platinum blonde bombshell, famous, among other things, for a photograph in which she gave Sophia Loren an unmistakable eyeful of her figure, attracted admirers by the dozen throughout her career. She was even rumored, though never confirmed, to have had a relationship with President John F. Kennedy. Her most infamous romantic connection, however, was with Anton LaVey, founder of the Church of Satan. LaVey only went public with claims about their relationship after Mansfield had already died, which means the full truth of that connection remains murky at best, a rumor that outlived the woman it was told about. Mansfield built her public identity around a very specific formula: platinum hair, an hourglass figure, and a relentless string of publicity stunts that kept her name in the papers whether or not she had a film in theaters. She was one of the earliest Playboy playmates, and she leveraged that early fame directly into a movie career, a savvy career move for a woman frequently, and unfairly, dismissed as simply a knockoff of Marilyn Monroe. That dismissal missed the point entirely. Mansfield was, by most accounts, genuinely brilliant, reportedly boasting an IQ of 163 and fluency in 5 languages, details that rarely made it into the tabloid coverage that otherwise dominated her public image. She was a woman who understood exactly how to manufacture spectacle, and used that skill deliberately to build a career in an industry that rarely let women outside of acting control their own narratives. Her life ended with brutal suddenness. Mansfield died in a car accident at just 34 years old, cutting short a career that was still very much in motion. In her brief time in the spotlight, though, she packed in more romance, glamour, and headline-grabbing controversy than most stars manage in decades. Mansfield's relationship with publicity was almost scientific in its precision. She understood, earlier than most of her contemporaries, that a single well-timed photograph could generate more career momentum than a mediocre film role, and she leaned into that reality with total commitment, showing up to press events in increasingly daring outfits, engineering wardrobe malfunctions that dominated headlines for days, and cultivating a public persona so exaggerated it became almost a character in its own right. Critics at the time often failed to see past the spectacle, dismissing her as a novelty act rather than a calculated media strategist working years ahead of her time. Her connection to Anton LaVey has remained one of the most debated footnotes in her biography precisely because of its timing, announced only after Mansfield could no longer confirm or deny it herself, raising lasting questions about how much of the story was genuine history and how much was posthumous myth-making attached to a woman no longer able to push back. Mansfield turned scandal into strategy long before that approach became a standard Hollywood playbook, proving that a star could manufacture her own headlines rather than simply react to them. The next star did something even rarer for a working actress of the era. She became a literal princess, but only after living a Hollywood love life every bit as wild and unrestrained as the ones that came before it. Actor number 9, Grace Kelly. Grace Kelly's reputation as Hollywood's most elegant and proper leading lady owes a great deal to the fact that, in 1956, she became a literal princess, marrying Prince Rainier III of Monaco in a wedding watched by an estimated 30 million television viewers, with a dress that would go on to shape bridal fashion for decades. She appeared in just 11 films, yet remains remembered as one of the most sophisticated icons the Golden Age ever produced. But before the crown, Grace Kelly knew exactly how to have fun, and she rarely let the conventions of the era slow her down. It began on the set of High Noon, where she started a romance with co-star Gary Cooper, a man 28 years her senior and, notably, married at the time. That combination, a much older man, a married man, would become something of a pattern for Kelly in the years that followed. While filming Magambo in Africa, She had an affair with another older leading man, Clark Gable. She later insisted the real draw of the project had been working with director John Ford and experiencing Africa itself, though by her own admission, being paired with Gable didn't hurt. Asked about the affair afterward, Kelly reportedly offered a memorably candid line. "What else is there to do if you're alone in a tent in Africa with Clark Gable?" The years that followed brought flings and affairs with a rotating cast of co-stars, including Bing Crosby, Marlon Brando, Ray Milland, and Oleg Cassini. She even dated another older royal figure, Prince Ali Khan, leader of the Nizari Ismaili Muslims, a relationship that, in hindsight, looks almost like a rehearsal for the life that awaited her. By the time she met Prince Rainier, Kelly had thoroughly lived the romantic life the studio system rarely permitted its female stars to acknowledge publicly. Her transformation from movie star to reigning princess played out like a fairy tale, but it was a fairy tale built on a foundation of real independence and real romantic freedom that few of her contemporaries were allowed to claim so openly. What made Kelly's romantic history particularly striking was how deliberately she seemed to seek out older, established men, a pattern biographers have since read as a young actress testing the boundaries of an industry that rarely let women her age exercise any real power. Working opposite men decades her senior gave her access to a different tier of Hollywood influence than most starlets her age could reach, and she used that access with evident confidence rather than naivety. Her transition into royalty was not without real personal cost. Once she became Princess Grace, Monaco's palace effectively barred her from returning to acting altogether, a condition of her new role that reportedly weighed on her for the rest of her life, even as she embraced her responsibilities as a head of state's wife with characteristic grace. She died in 1982 following a car accident on the same winding coastal roads that had once made Monaco feel like a fairy tale setting, a tragic and almost cinematic end to a life that had always blurred the line between real romance and staged spectacle. Kelly chose royalty over acting in the end, closing the door on Hollywood entirely once she crossed into palace life. The next star chose either path. She built one of the most complicated, most talked about love stories in Hollywood history around a man she never actually married at all.